The Restoration and the 18th century 1660 to 1785. 1660, Charles II restored to the English throne 1688-89, the Glorious Revolution, deposition of James II and Ashes Zion of William of Orange 1700, death of John Dryden 1707. 1714, 1744-5, 1784. Act of Union unites Scotland and England, creating the nation of Great Britain. Rule by House of Hanover begins with accession of George I. Deaths of Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. Death of Samuel Johnson. The Restoration and the 18th century brought vast changes to the island of Great Britain, which became a single nation after 1707, when the Act of Union joined Scotland to England and Wales. After the prolonged civil and religious strife of the 17th century, Britain attained political stability and unprecedented commercial vigor. The countryside kept its seemingly timeless agricultural rhythms, even as the nation's great families consolidated their control over the land and those who worked it. Change came most dramatically to cities, which absorbed much of a national population that nearly doubled in the period, to 10 million. Britons came together in civil society, the public but non-governmental institutions and practices that became newly powerful in the period. The theaters, reopened at the Restoration, coffee houses, concert halls, pleasure gardens, lending libraries, picture exhibitions, and shopping districts gave life in London and elsewhere a feeling of bustle and friction. Reflecting and stimulating this activity, an expanding assortment of printed works vied to interest literate women and men, whose numbers grew to include most of the middle classes and many among the poor. Civil society also linked people to an increasingly global economy, as they shopped for diverse goods from around the world. The rich and even the moderately well-off could profit or go broke from investments in joint stock companies, which controlled much of Britain's international trade, including its lucrative traffic in slaves. At home, new systems of canals and turnpikes stimulated domestic trade, industry, and travel, bringing distant parts of the country closer together. The cohesion of the nation also depended on ideas of social order, some old and clear, many subtle and new. An ethos of politeness came to prevail, a standard of social behavior to which more and more could aspire. Yet that served to distinguish the privileged sharply from the rude and vulgar. This and other ideas, of order and hierarchy, of liberty and rights, of sentiment and sympathy, helped determine the ways in which an expanding diversity of people could seek to participate in Britain's thriving cultural life. Religion and politics. The Restoration of 1660, the return of Charles Stuart and, with him, the monarchy to England brought hope to a divided nation, exhausted by years of civil war and political turmoil. Almost all of Charles's subjects welcomed him home. After the abdication of Richard Cromwell in 1659, the country had seemed at the brink of chaos, and Britons were eager to believe that their king would bring order and law and a spirit of mildness back into the national life. But no political settlement could be stable until the religious issues had been resolved. The restoration of the monarchy meant that the established church would also be restored, and though Charles was willing to pardon or ignore many former enemies, such as Milton, the bishops and Anglican clergy were less tolerant of dissent. When Parliament reimposed the Book of Common Prayer in 1662 and then in 1664 barred nonconformists from religious meetings outside the established church, thousands of clergymen resigned their livings, and the jails were filled with preachers like John Bunyan who refused to be silenced. In 1673 the Test Act required all holders of civil and military offices to take the sacrament in an Anglican church and to deny belief in transubstantiation. Thus Protestant dissenters and Roman Catholics were largely excluded from public life. For instance, Alexander Pope, a Catholic, could not attend a university, own land, or vote. The scorn of Anglicans for nonconformist zeal or enthusiasm, a belief in private revelation, bursts out in Samuel Butler's popular Hudibras, 1663, a caricature of Presbyterians and Independents. And English Catholics were widely regarded as potential traitors and, wrongly, thought to have set the great fire that destroyed much of London in 1666. Yet the triumph of the established church did not resolve the constitutional issues that had divided Charles I and Parliament. Charles II had promised to govern through Parliament but slyly tried to consolidate royal power. Steering away from crises, he hid his Catholic sympathies and avoided a test of strength with Parliament except on one occasion. In 1678 the report of the Popish plot, in which Catholics would rise and murder their Protestant foes, terrified London, and though the charge turned out to be a fraud, the House of Commons exploited the fear by treating to force Charles to exclude his Catholic brother, James, Duke of York, from succession to the throne. The turmoil of this period is captured brilliantly by Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel, 1681. Finally, Charles defeated the exclusion bill by dissolving Parliament. But the crisis resulted in a basic division of the country between two new political parties, the Tories, who supported the king, and the Whigs, the king's opponents. Neither party could live with James II. After he came to the throne in 1685, he claimed the right to make his own laws, suspended the Test Act, and began to fill the army and government with fellow Catholics. The birth of James's son in 1688 brought matters to a head, confronting the nation with the prospect of a Catholic dynasty. Secret negotiations paved the way for the Dutchman William of Orange, a champion of Protestantism and the husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary. William landed with a small army in southwestern England and marched toward London. As he advanced the king's allies melted away, and James fled to a permanent exile in France. But the House of Stuart would be heard from again. For more than half a century some loyal Jacobites, from the Latin Jacobus, James, especially in Scotland, supported James, his son, the Old Pretender, and his grandson, the Young Pretender or Bonnie Prince Charlie, as the legitimate rulers of Britain. Moreover, a good many writers, from Afraben and Dryden, and arguably Pope and Johnson, to Robert Burns, privately sympathized with Jacobitism. But after the failure of one last rising in 1745, the cause would dwindle gradually into a wistful sentiment. In retrospect, the coming of William and Mary in 1688 the glorious, or bloodless, revolution came to be seen as the beginning of a stabilized, unified Great Britain. A lasting settlement followed. In 1689 a Bill of Rights revoked James's actions, it limited the powers of the Crown, reaffirmed the supremacy of Parliament, and guaranteed some individual rights. The same year the Toleration Act relaxed the strain of religious conflict by granting a limited freedom of worship to dissenters, although not to Catholics or Jews, so long as they swore allegiance to the Crown. This proved to be a workable compromise, and with the passage of the Act of Settlement in 1701, putting Sophia, Electress of Hanover, and her descendants in line for the throne, as the granddaughter of James I, she was the closest Protestant relative of Princess Anne, James I's younger daughter, whose sole surviving child died in that year, the difficult problems that had so long divided England seemed resolved. The principles established in 1689 endured unaltered in essentials until the Reform Bill of 1832. During Anne's reign, 1702-14, new political tensions embittered the nation. In the War of the Spanish Succession, 1702-13, England and its allies defeated France and Spain, as these commercial rivals were weakened. And war profits flowed in, the Whig lords and London merchants supporting. The war grew rich. The spoils included new colonies and the asiento, a contract to supply slaves to the Spanish Empire. The hero of the war, Captain General John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, won the famous victory of Blenheim, was showered with honors and wealth, and, with his Duchess, dominated the Queen until 1710. But the Whigs and Marlborough pushed their luck too hard. When the Whigs tried to reward the dissenters for their loyalty by removing the test, and fought back to defend the established church, she dismissed her Whig ministers and the Marlboroughs and called in Robert Harley and the brilliant young Henry St. John to form a Tory ministry. These ministers employed prominent writers like Defoe and Swift and commissioned Matthew Prior to negotiate the Peace of Utrecht, 1713. Wrought to Swift's despair, he later burlesqued events at court. In Gulliver's Travels a bitter rivalry broke out between Harley, now Earl of Oxford, and St. John, now Viscount Bolingbroke. Though Bolingbroke succeeded in ousting Oxford, the death of Anne in 1714 reversed his fortunes. The Whigs returned to power, and George I, Sophia's son, became the first Hanoverian king. He would reign until 1727. Harley was imprisoned in the Tower of London until 1717, and Bolingbroke, charged with being a Jacobite traitor, fled to France. Government was now securely in the hands of the Whigs. The political principles of the Whig and Tory parties, which bring so much fire to 18th-century public debate, evolved to address changing circumstances through the period. Now we tend to think of Tories as conservative and Whigs as liberal. Members of today's Conservative Party in the United Kingdom are sometimes called Tories. During the exclusion crisis of the 1680s, the Whigs asserted the liberties of the English subject against the royal prerogatives of Charles II, whom Tories such as Dryden supported. After both parties survived the 1688 Glorious Revolution, the Tories guarded the preeminence of the established church, sometimes styling themselves the Church Party, while Whigs tended to support toleration of dissenters. Economically, too, Tories defined themselves as traditionalists, affirming land ownership as the proper basis of wealth, power, and privilege, though most thought trade honorable, whereas the Whigs came to be seen as supporting a new moneyed interest, as Swift called it, managers off Bank of England, founded 1694, contrivers of a system of public credit, and investors in the stock market. But conservatism and liberalism did not exist as coherent ideologies in the period, and the vicissitudes of party dispute offer many surprises. When Bolingbroke returned to England in 1724 after being pardoned, he led a Tory opposition that decried the ministerial tyranny of Whig government. This opposition patriotically hailed liberty in a manner recalling the Whig rhetoric of earlier decades, appealed to both landed gentry and urban merchants, and arguably anticipated the anti-government radicalism of the end of the 18th century. Conversely, the Whigs sought to secure a centralized fiscal and military state machine and a web of financial interdependence controlled by the wealthiest aristocrats. The great architect of this Whig policy was Robert Walpole, who came to power as a result of the South Sea Bubble, 1720, a stock market crash. His ability to restore confidence and keep the country running smoothly, as well as total money, would mark his long ascendancy. Coming to be known as Britain's first prime minister, he consolidated his power during the reign of George II, 1727-60. More involved in British affairs than his essentially German father, George II came to appreciate the efficient administration of the patronage system under Walpole, who installed dependents in government offices and controlled the House of Commons by financially rewarding its members. Many great writers found these methods offensive and embraced Bolingbroke's new Tory rhetoric, extolling the Englishman's fierce independence from the corrupting power of centralized government and concentrations of wealth. Gay's Beggar's Opera, 1728, and Fielding's Jonathan Wild, 1743, draw parallels between great criminals and great politicians, and Pope's Dunciad uses Walpole as an emblem of the venal commercialization of the whole social fabric. This distaste, however, did not prevent Pope himself from marketing his poems as cleverly as he wrote them. Walpole fell in 1742 because he was unwilling to go to war against the French and Spanish, a war he thought would cost too much but that many perceived would enhance Britain's wealth still further. The next major English statesman, William Pitt the Elder, appealed to a spirit of national patriotism and called for the expansion of British power and commerce overseas. The defeat of the French in the 7 Years' War, 1756-63, especially in North America, was largely his doing. The long reign of George III, 1760-1820, was dominated by two great concerns, the emergence of Britain as a colonial power and the cry for a new social order based on liberty and radical reform. In 1763 the Peace of Paris consolidated British rule over Canada and India, and not even the later loss of the American colonies could stem the rise of the empire. Great Britain was no longer an isolated island but a nation with interests and responsibilities around the world. At home, however, there was discontent. The wealth brought to England by industrialism and foreign trade had not spread to the great mass of the poor. For much of the century, few had questioned the idea that those at the top of the social hierarchy rightfully held power. Rich families' alliances and rivalries, national and local, dominated politics, while male property owners could vote in parliamentary elections. They and others of the middle classes and the poor had mostly followed the powerful people who could best help them thrive or at least survive. But toward the end of the century it seemed to many that the bonds of custom that once held people together had finally broken, and now money alone was respected. Protestants turned against Catholics. In 1780 the Gordon riots put London temporarily under mob rule. The king was popular with his subjects and tried to take government into his own hands, rising above partisanship, but his efforts often backfired as when the American colonists took him for a tyrant. From 1788 to the end of his life, moreover, an inherited disease, porphyria, periodically unhinged his mind, as in a memorable scene described by Francis Roney. Meanwhile, reformers such as John Wilkes and Richard Price called for a new political democracy. Fear of their radicalism would contribute to the British reaction against the French Revolution. In the last decades of the century British authors would be torn between two opposing attitudes, loyalty to the old traditions of subordination, mutual obligations, and local self-sufficiency, and yearning for a new dispensation founded on principles of liberty, the rule of reason, and human rights. The context of ideas. Much of the most powerful writing after 1660 exposed divisions in the nation's thinking that derived from the tumult of earlier decades. As the possibility of a Christian commonwealth receded, the great Republican John Milton published Paradise Lost, Final Version, 1674, and John Bunyan's immensely popular masterwork Pilgrim's Progress, 1679, expressed the conscience of an nonconformist. Conversely, an aristocratic culture, led by Charles II himself, aggressively celebrated pleasure and the right of the elite to behave extravagantly. Members of the court scandalized respectable London citizens and considered their wives and daughters fair game. The court's hero, the Earl of Rochester, became a celebrity for enacting the creed of a libertine and rake. The delights of the court also took more refined forms. French and Italian musicians, as well as painters from the Low Countries, migrated to England. And playhouses closed by the Puritans since 1642 sprang back to life. In 1660 Charles authorized 2 new companies of actors, the King's Players and the Dukes. Their repertory included witty, bawdy comedies written and acted by women as well as men. But as stark as the contrasts were during the Restoration between libertine and religious intellectuals, royalists and republicans, high churchmen and nonconformists, the court and the rest of the country, a spirit of compromise was brewing. Perhaps the most widely shared intellectual impulse off age was a distrust of dogmatism. Nearly everybody blamed it for the civil strife through which the nation had recently passed. Opinions varied widely about which dogmatism was most dangerous: Puritan enthusiasm, papal infallibility, the divine right of kings, medieval scholastic or modern Cartesian philosophy, but these were denounced in remarkably similar terms. As far apart intellectually and temperamentally as Rochester and Milton were, both portray overconfidence in human reasoning as the supreme disaster. It is the theme of Butler's Hudibras and much of the work of Dryden. Many philosophers, scientists, and divines began to embrace a mitigated skepticism, which argued that human beings could readily achieve a sufficient degree of necessary knowledge, sometimes called moral certainty, but also contended that the pursuit of absolute certainty was vain, mad, and socially calamitous. If, as the commentator Martin Clifford put it in a treatise of humane reason, 1675, in this vast latitude of probabilities, a person thinks there is none can lead one to salvation, but the path wherein he treads himself, we may see the evident and necessary consequence of eternal troubles and confusions. Such writers insist that a distrust of human capacities is fully compatible with religious faith. For them the inability of reason and sensory evidence to settle important questions reveals our need to accept Christian mysteries as our intellectual foundation. Dryden's poem Religio Late, 1682, explains, so pale grows reason in religion's sight, so dies, and so dissolves in supernatural light. Far from inhibiting fresh thinking, however, the distrust of old dogmas inspired new theories, projects, and explorations. In Leviathan, 1651, Thomas Hobbes jettisoned the notion of a divine basis for kingly authority, proposing instead a naturalistic argument for royal absolutism begun from the claim that mere matter in motion composes the universe. If not checked by an absolute sovereign, mankind's perpetual and restless desire of power after power could lead to civic collapse. Other materialist philosophies derived from ancient Epicurean thought, which was Christianized by the French philosopher Pierre Gassendi, 1592-1655. The Epicurean doctrine that the universe consists only of minuscule atoms and void unnerved some thinkers. Swift roundly mocks it in A Tale of a Tub, but it also energized efforts to examine the world with deliberate, acute attention. This new scientific impulse advanced Francis Bacon's program of methodical experimentation and inductive reasoning formulated earlier in the century. Charles II gave official approval to the scientific revolution by chartering the Royal Society of London for the improving of natural knowledge in 1662. But observations of nature advanced both formally and informally in an eclectic range of areas. The specialized, professional scientist we know today did not yet exist. And new features of the world were disclosed to everyone who had the chance to look. 2 wonderful inventions, the microscope and telescope, had begun to reveal that nature is more extravagant, teeming with tiny creatures and boundless galaxies than anyone had ever imagined. One book that stayed popular for more than a century, Fontenelle's Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, 1686, translated from French by Ben and later by Bernie, suggested that an infinite number of alternate worlds and living creatures might exist, not only in outer space but under our feet, invisibly small. Travels to unfamiliar regions of the globe also enlarged understandings of what nature could do. Ben's classifying and collecting of South American flora and fauna in Orinoco show how the appetite for wondrous facts kept pace with the economic motives of world exploration and colonization. Encounters with hitherto little-known societies in the Far East, Africa, and the Americas enlarged Europeans' understanding of human norms as well. In Gidliver's Travels, Swift shows the comical, painful ways in which the discovery of new cultures forces one average Briton to re-examine his own. Scientific discovery and exploration also affected religious attitudes. Alongside natural history, the collection and description of facts of nature, and natural philosophy, the study of the causes of what happens in nature, thinkers of the period placed natural religion, the study of nature as a book written by God. Newly discovered natural laws, such as Newton's laws of optics and celestial mechanics, seemed evidence of a universal order in creation, which implied God's hand in the design of the universe, as a watch implies a watchmaker. Expanded knowledge of peoples around the world who had never heard of Christianity led theologians to formulate supposedly universal religious tenets available to all rational beings. Some intellectuals embraced deism, the doctrine that religion need not depend on mystery or biblical truths and could rely on reason alone, which recognized the goodness and wisdom of natural law and its creator. Natural religion could not, however, discern an act of God who punished vice and rewarded virtue in this life. Evidently the first cause had withdrawn from the universe he set in motion. Many Orthodox Christians shuddered at the vision of a vast, impersonal machine of nature. Instead they rested their faith on the revelation of Scripture, the scheme of salvation in which Christ died to redeem our sins. Other Christians, such as Pope in an essay on Man and Thompson in the Seasons, espoused arguments for natural religion that they felt did not conflict with or diminish Orthodox belief. Some people began to argue that the achievements of modern inquiry had eclipsed those of the ancients, and the fathers of the Church, who had not known about the solar system, the New World, microscopic organisms, or the circulation of the blood. The school curriculum began with years of Latin and Greek, inculcating a long-established humanistic tradition that many authors, including Swift and Pope, still cherished. A battle of the books erupted in the late 17th century between champions of ancient and of modern learning. Swift crusade fiercely in this battle. Gulliver's Travels denounces the pointlessness and arrogance he saw in experiments of the Royal Society, while a modest proposal depicts a peculiar new cruelty and indifference to moral purpose made possible by statistics and economics, 2 fields pioneered by Royal Society member Sir William Petty. But as sharp as such disagreements were, accommodation was also possible. Even as works such as Newton's Principia, 1687, and Optics, 1704, revolutionized previously held views of the world, Newton himself maintained a seemly diffidence, comparing himself to a boy playing on the seashore whilst the great ocean of truth lay all in these covered before me. He and other modest modern inquirers such as Locke won the admiration of Pope and many ardent defenders of the past. The widespread devotion to the direct observation of experience established empiricism as the dominant intellectual attitude of the age, which would become Britain's great legacy to world philosophy. Locke and his heirs George Berkeley and David Hume pursue the experiential approach in widely divergent directions. But even when they reach conclusions shocking to common sense, they tend to reassert the security of our prior knowledge. Berkeley insists we know the world only through our senses and thus cannot prove that any material thing exists, but he uses that argument to demonstrate the necessity of faith, because reality amounts to no more than a perception in the mind of God. Hume's famous argument about causation, that causes and effects are discoverable, not by reason but by experience, grounds our sense of the world not on rational reflection but on spontaneous, unreflective beliefs and feelings. Perhaps Locke best expresses the temper of his times in the essay concerning human understanding, 1690. If by this inquiry into the nature of the understanding, I can discover the powers thereof, how far they reach, to what things they are in any degree proportionate, and where they fail us, I suppose it may be of use, to prevail with the busy mind of man to be more cautious in meddling with things exceeding its comprehension, to stop when it is at the utmost extent of its tether, and to sit down in a quiet ignorance of those things which, upon examination, are found to be beyond the reach of our capacities. Our business here is not to know all things, but those which concern our conduct. Such a position is Swift's, when he inveighs against metaphysics, abstract logical deductions, and theoretical science. It is similar to Pope's warning against human presumption in an essay on man. It prompts Johnson to talk of the business of living and to restrain the flights of unbridled imagination. And it helps account for the Anglican clergy's dislike of emotion and enthusiasm in religion and for their emphasis on good works, rather than faith, as the way to salvation. Locke's empiricism pervaded 18th century British thought on politics, education, and morals as well as philosophy. Johnson's great dictionary, 1755, uses more than 1,500 illustrations from his writings. Yet perhaps the most momentous new idea at the turn of the 18th century was set against Lockean thinking. The groundbreaking intellectual Mary Estelle, in a serious proposal to the ladies, 1694, and some reflections upon marriage, 1706, initiated a powerful strain of modern feminism, arguing for the establishment of women's educational institutions and decrying the tyranny that husbands legally exercised over their wives. She nonetheless mocked the calls for political rights and liberty by Locke and other Whig theorists, rights that pointedly did not extend to women. Instead, she and other early feminists, including Sarah Fudge Edgerton and Mary, Lady Chudley, embraced the Tory principle of obedience to royal and church authority. Women's advocates had to fight tyrant custom, in Edgerton's words, rooted in ancient traditions of domestic power and enshrined in the Bible and mythic human prehistory. This struggle seemed distinct from public political denunciations of the tyranny of some relatively recent Charles or James. Estelle feared that the doctrines of male revolutionaries could produce civil chaos and so jeopardize the best that women could hope for in her day, the freedom to become fully educated, practice their religion, and marry, or not, according to their own enlightened judgment. Other thinkers, male and female, began to advocate improving women's education as part of a wider commitment to enhancing and extending sociability. Richard Steele's periodical The Tatler satirized Estelle as Maid O'Nella because she seemed to recommend women to a nun-like, recluse life. In The Spectator, 1711-12, 1714, conversely, Steele and Joseph Addison encouraged women to learn to participate in an increasingly sociable, intellectually sophisticated, urbane world, where all sorts of people could mingle, as in the streets and parks of a thriving city like London. Such periodicals sought to teach as large a readership as possible to think and behave politely. On a more aristocratic plane, the characteristics of men, manners, opinions, and times, 1711, by the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury similarly asserted the naturally social meaning of human character and meditated on the affections, the witty intercourse, and the standards of politeness that bind people together. Such ideas led to the popularity around mid-century of a new word, sentimental, which locates the basis of social conduct in instinctual feeling rather than divinely sanctioned moral codes. Religion itself, according to Lawrence Stern, might be a great sensorium, a sort of central nervous system that connects the feelings of all living creatures in one great benevolent soul. And people began to feel exquisite pleasure in the exercise of charity. The cult of sensibility fostered a philanthropy that led to social reform seldom envisioned in earlier times, to the improvement of jails, the relief of imprisoned debtors, the establishment of foundling hospitals and of homes for penitent prostitutes, and ultimately the abolition of the slave trade. And it also loosed a ready flow of sympathetic responses to the joys and sorrows of fellow human beings. Another passion that transformed British culture in the period was curiosity. Scientific discoveries increasingly found practical applications in industry, the arts, and even entertainment. By the late 1740s, as knowledge of electricity advanced, public experiments offered fashionable British crowds the opportunity to electrocute themselves. Amateurs everywhere amused themselves with air pumps and chemical explosions. Birmingham became famous as a center where science and manufacturing were combining to change the world. In the early 1760s, Matthew Boulton, 1728 to 1809, established the most impressive factory of the age just outside town, producing vast quantities of pins, buckles, and buttons. In subsequent decades, his applications and manufacture of the new steam engine invented by Scotsman James Watt, 1736-1819, helped build an industry to drive all others. Practical chemistry also led to industrial improvements. Domestic porcelain production became established in the 1750s, and from the 1760s Josiah Wedgwood, 1730-95, developed glazing, manufacturing, and marketing techniques that enabled British ceramics to compete with China for fashionable taste. In 1765 he named his creamware Queensware to remind customers of its place on Queen Charlotte's table. Wedgwood and others answered an ever-increasing demand in Britain for beautiful objects. Artist William Hogarth satirized this appetite of the upper and middle classes for the accumulation of finery. A chaotic collection of China figurines crowds the mantel in Plate 2 of Marriage à la Mode, 1743-45. Yet the images that made Hogarth famous would soon decorate English ceramic teapots and plates and be turned into porcelain figurines themselves. New forms of religious devotion sprang up amid Britain's spectacular Madrigal success. The evangelical revival known as Methodism began in the 1730s. Led by 3 Oxford graduates, John Wesley, 1703-1791, his brother Charles, 1707 to 1788, and George Whitefield, 1714 to 1770. The Methodists took their gospel to the common people, warning that all were sinners and damned, unless they accepted amazing grace, salvation through faith. Often denied the privilege of preaching in village churches, evangelicals preached to thousands in barns or the open fields. The emotionalism of such revival meetings repelled the somnolent Anglican Church and the upper classes, who feared that the fury and zeal of the Puritan sects were returning. Methodism was sometimes related to madness. Convinced that he was damned forever, the poet William Cowper broke down and became a recluse. But the religious awakening persisted and affected many clergymen and laymen within the establishment, who reanimated the church and promoted unworldliness and piety. Nor did the insistence of Methodists on faith over works as the way to salvation prevent them or their Anglican allies from fighting for social reforms. The campaign to abolish slavery and the slave trade was driven largely by a passion to save souls. Sentimentalism, evangelicalism, and the pursuits of wealth and luxury in different ways all placed a new importance on individuals, the gratification of their tastes and ambitions or their yearning for personal encounters with each other or a personal God. Diary keeping, elaborate letter writing, and the novel also testified to the growing importance of the private, individual life. Few histories of kings or nations could rival Richardson's novel Clarissa in length, popularity, or documentary detail. It was subtitled The History of a Young Lady. The older hierarchical system had tended to subordinate individuals to their social rank or station. In the 18th century that fixed system began to break down, and people's sense of themselves began to change. By the end of the century many issues of politics and the law revolve around rights, not traditions. The modern individual had been invented, no product of the age is more enduring. Conditions of literary production. Publishing boomed as never before in 18th century Britain, as the number of titles appearing annually and the periodicals published in London and the provincial towns dramatically increased. This expansion in part resulted from a loosening of legal restraints on printing. Through much of the previous 3 centuries, the government had licensed the texts deemed suitable for publication and refused to license those it wanted suppressed, a practice called prior restraint. After the Restoration, the new Printing Act, 1662, tightened licensing controls, though unlike his Stuart predecessors Charles II now shared this power with Parliament. But in 1695, during the reign of William III, the last in a series of printing acts was not renewed. Debate in Parliament on the matter was more practical than idealistic. It was argued that licensing fettered the printing trades and was ineffective at preventing obnoxious publications anyway, which could be better constrained after publication by enforcing laws against seditious libel, obscenity, and treason. As the two-party system consolidated, both Whigs and Tories seemed to realize that pre-publicatine censorship could bite them when their own side happened to be out of power. Various governments attempted to revive licensing during political crises throughout the 18th century, but it was gone for good. This did not end the legal liabilities, and the prosecutions, O fathers. Daniel Defoe, for instance, was convicted of seditious libel and faced the pillory and jail for his satirical pamphlet The Shortest Way with the Dissenters, 1702, which imitated high church zeal so extravagantly that it provoked both the Tories and the dissenters he had set about to defend. And licensing of the stage returned, irritated especially by Henry Fielding's anti-government play The Historical Register for the year 1736, Robert Walpole pushed the stage licensing act through Parliament in 1737, which authorized the Lord Chamberlain to license all plays and reduce the number of London theatres to 2, Drury Lane and Covent Garden, closing Fielding's new theatre in the Haymarket and driving him to a new career as a novelist. But despite such constraints, Hume could begin his essay of the liberty of the press, 1741, by citing the extreme liberty we enjoy in this country of communicating whatever we please to the public as an internationally recognized commonplace. This freedom allowed 18th century Britain to build an exemplary version of what historians have called the public sphere, a cultural arena, free of direct government control, consisting of not just published comment on matters of national interest but also the public venues, coffee houses, clubs, taverns where readers circulated, discussed, and conceived responses to it. The first regular daily London newspaper, the Daily Courant, appeared in 1702, in 1731, the first magazine, the Gentleman's Magazine. The latter was followed both by imitations and by successful literary journals like the Monthly Review, 1749, and the Critical Review, 1756. Each audience attracted some periodical tailored to it, as with the Female Tattler, 1709, and Eliza Haywood's Female Spectator, 1744-46. After 1695, the legal status of printed matter became ambiguous, and in 1710 Parliament enacted the Statute of an Act for the encouragement of learning by vesting the copies of printed books in the authors or purchasers of such copies, the first copyright law in British history not tied to government approval of works' contents. Typically, these copyrights were held by booksellers, who operated much as publishers do today. In the 18th century, publisher referred to one who distributed books. A bookseller paid an author for a work's copyright and, after registering the work with the stationer's company for a fee, had exclusive right for 14 years to publish it. If alive when this term expired, he owned it another 14 years. Payments to authors for copyright varied. Pope got £15 for the 1714 version of The Rape of the Lock, while Samuel Johnson's Rasselas earned him £100. The Statute of Anne spurred the book trade by enhancing booksellers' control over works and hence their chance to profit by them. But the government soon introduced a new constraint. In 1712, the first Stamp Act put a tax on all newspapers, advertisements, paper, and pamphlets. Effectively any work under 100 pages or so, all printed matter had to carry the stamp indicating the taxes had been paid. Happily for Anne and her ministry, the act both raised government revenue and drove a number of the more irresponsible, ephemeral newspapers out of business, though the Spectator simply doubled its price and thrived. Stamp acts were in effect throughout the century, and duties tended to increase when the government needed to raise money and rein in the press, as during the 7 Years' War in 1757. But such constraints were not heavy enough to hold back the publishing market, which began to sustain the first true professional class of authors in British literary history. The lower echelon of the profession was called Grub Street, which was, as Johnson's dictionary explains, originally the name of a street in Moorfields in London, much inhabited by writers of small histories, dictionaries, and temporary poems. The market increasingly motivated the literary elite too, and Johnson himself came to remark that no man but a blockhead ever wrote, except for money. As a young writer, he sold articles to the Gentleman's Magazine, and many other men and women struggled to survive doing piecework for periodicals. The enhanced opportunity to sell their works on the open market meant that fewer authors needed to look to aristocratic patrons for support. But a new practice, publication by subscription, blended elements of patronage and literary capitalism and created the century's most spectacular authorial fortunes. Wealthy readers could subscribe to a work in progress, usually by agreeing to pay the author half in advance and half upon receipt of the book. Subscribers were rewarded with an edition more sumptuous than the common run and the appearance of their names in a list in the book's front pages. Major works by famous authors, such as Dryden's translation of Virgil, 1697, and the 1718 edition of Prior's poems, generate the most subscription sales. The grandest success was Pope's translation of Homer's Iliad, 1715-20, which gained him about £5,000. His Odyssey, 1725-26, raised nearly that much. But smaller projects deemed to need spell encouragement also sold by subscription, including nearly all books of poetry by women, such as Mary Leaper's poems, 1751. MOT all entered the literary market with equal advantages, and social class played a role, though hardly a simple one, in preparing authors for success. The better educated were better placed to be taken seriously. Many eminent male writers, including Dryden, Locke, Addison, Swift, Hume, Johnson, Burke, the list could go on and on, had at least some university education. Either at Oxford or Cambridge or at Scottish or Irish universities, where it dance by members of the laboring classes was virtually nil. Also, universities were officially closed to non-Anglicans. Some important writers attended the dissenting academies that sprang up to fulfill nonconformists' educational aspirations. Defoe went to an excellent one at Newington Green. A few seal-brat authors such as Rochester and Henry Fielding had aristocratic backgrounds, but many came from the middle class, though those in this category show how heterogeneous it was. Pope, a Catholic, obtained his educatine privately, and his father was a linen wholesaler, but he eventually became intimate with earls and viscounts, whereas Richardson, who had a family background in trade and, as he said, only common school learning, was a successful printer before he became a novelist. Roth were middle class in a sense and made their own fortunes in 18th century print culture, yet they inhabited vastly different social worlds. Despite the general exclusion of the poor from education and other means of social advancement, some self-educated writers of the laboring classes fought their way into print. A few became celebrities, aided by the increasing popularity of the idea, famously expressed by Gray in his elegy written in a country churchyard, that there must be unknown geniuses among the poor. Stephen Duck, an agricultural worker from Wiltshire, published his popular poems on several subjects in 1730, which included the thresher's labor. He became known as the thresher poet. Queen Caroline herself retained him to be keeper of her library in Richmond. Several authors of the common sort followed in Duck's wake, including Mary Collier, whose poem The Woman's Labor, an epistle to Mr. Duck, 1739, defended country women against charges of idleness. Apart from such visible successes, 18th century print culture afforded work for many from lower socioeconomic levels, if not as authors, then as hawkers of newspapers on city streets and singers of political ballads, who were often illiterate and female, bookbinders, paper makers, and printing press workers. The vigor of the literary market demanded the labor of all classes. As all women were barred from universities and faced innumerable other disadvantages and varieties of repression, the story of virtually every woman author in the period is one of self-education, courage, and extraordinary initiative. Yet women did publish widely for the first time in the period, and the examples that can be assembled are as diverse as they are impressive. During the Restoration and early 18th century, a few aristocratic women poets were hailed as marvelous exceptions and given fanciful names. The poems of Catherine Phillips, 1631-1664, The Matchless Orinda, were published post humously in 1667, and others, including Anne Finch and Killigrew, and later, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, printed poems or circulated them in manuscript among fashionable circles. A more broadly public sort of female authorship was more ambivalently received. Though Afroban built a successful career in the theater and in print, her sexually frank works were sometimes denounced as unbecoming a woman. Many women writers of popular literature after her in the early 18th century assumed scandalous public roles. Delariviere Manley published transparent fictionalizations of the doings of the Whig nobility, including the New Atalantis, 1709, while Eliza Haywood produced stories about seduction and sex, though her late works, including the History of Miss Betsy Thoughtless, 1751, courted a rising taste for morality. Male defenders of high culture found it easy to denounce these women and their works as affronts simultaneously to sexual decency and good literary taste. Pope's Dunciad, 1728, awards Haywood as the prize in a pissing contest between scurrilous male booksellers. Many women writers after mid-century were determined to be more moral than their predecessors. Around 1750, intellectual women established clubs of their own under the leadership of Elizabeth Vesey and Elizabeth Montagu, cousin to Lady Mary. Proclaiming a high religious and intellectual standard, these women came to be called Bluestockings, after the inelegant worst hose of an early member. Eminent men joined the Bluestockings for literary conversation, including Samuel Johnson, Samuel Richardson, Horace Walpole, novelist, celebrated letter writer, and son of the Prime Minister, and David Garrick, preeminent actor of his day. The literary accomplishments of Bluestockings ranged widely. In 1758 Elizabeth Carter published her translation of the Greek philosopher Epictetus, while Hannah More won fame as a poet, abolitionist, and educational theorist. Some of the most considerable literary achievements of women after mid-century came in the novel, a form increasingly directed at women readers, often exploring the moral difficulties of young women approaching marriage. The satirical novel The Female Quixote, 1752, by Charlotte Lennox describes one such heroine deluded by the extravagant romances she reads, while Frances Rawney's Evelina, 1778, unfolds the sexual and other dangers besetting its naive but good-hearted heroine. Readers' abilities and inclinations to consume literature help determine the volume and variety of published works. While historians disagree about how exactly the literacy rate changed in Britain through the early modern period, there is widespread consensus that by 1800 between 60 and 70% of adult men could read, in contrast to 25% in 1600. Since historians use the ability to sign one's name as an indicator of literacy, the evidence is even sketchier for women, who were less often parties to legal contracts, for perhaps a third of women could read by the mid-18th century. Reading was commoner among the relatively well-off than among the very poor, and among the latter, more prevalent in urban centers than the countryside. Most decisively, cultural commentators throughout the century portrayed literacy as a good in itself. Everyone in a Protestant country such as Britain, most thought, would benefit from direct access to the Bible and devotional works, and increasingly employers found literacy among servants and other laborers useful, especially those working in cities. Moral commentators did their best to steer inexperienced readers away from the frivolous and idle realm of popular imaginative literature, though literacy could not but give its new possessors freedom to explore their own tastes and inclinations. Cost placed another limit on readership. Few of the laboring classes would have disposable income to buy a cheap edition of Milton, around 2 shillings at mid-century, or even a copy of the Gentleman's Magazine, 6 pence, let alone the spare time or sense of entitlement to peruse such things. Nonetheless, reading material was widely shared. Addison optimistically calculated 20 readers to every paper of the Spectator, and occasionally servants were given access to the libraries of their employers or the rich family of the neighborhood. In the 1740s, circulating libraries began to emerge in cities and towns throughout Britain. Though the yearly fee they usually charged put them beyond the reach of the poor, these libraries gave the middle classes access to a wider array of books than they could afford to assemble on their own. Records of such libraries indicate that travels, histories, letters, and novels were most popular, though patrons borrowed many specialized, technical works as well. One fascinating index of change in the character of the reading public was the very look of words on the page. In the past, printers had rather capriciously capitalized many nouns words as common as wood or happiness and frequently italicized various words for emphasis. Right around the middle of the 18th century, new conventions arose, initial capitals were reserved for proper names, and the use of italics was reduced. Such changes indicate that the reading public was becoming sophisticated enough not to require such overt pointing to the meanings of what they read. The modern, 18th century reader had come to expect that all English writing, no matter how old or new, on any topic, in any genre, would be printed in the same consistent, uncluttered style. No innovation of the 18th century culture of reading more immediately demonstrates its linkage to our own literary principles. The literature appearing between 1660 and 1785 divides conveniently into 3 lesser periods of about 40 years each. The first, extending to the death of Dryden in 1700, is characterized by an effort to bring a new refinement to English literature according to sound critical principles of what is fitting and right. The second, ending with the deaths of Pope in 1744 and Swift in 1745, extends that effort to a wider circle of readers, with special satirical attention to what is unfitting and wrong. The third, concluding with the death of Johnson in 1784 and the publication of Cooper's The Task in 1785, confronts the old principles with revolutionary ideas that would come to the fore in the Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. A sudden change of taste seemed to occur around 1660. The change had been long prepared, however, by a trend in European culture, especially in 17th century France, the desire for an elegant simplicity. Reacting against the difficulty and occasional extravagance of late Renaissance literature, writers and critics called for a new restraint, clarity, regularity, and good sense. Donne's metaphysics and Milton's bold storming of heaven, for instance, seemed overdone to some Restoration readers. Hence Dryden and Andrew Marvell both were tempted to revise Paradise Lost, smoothing away its sublime but arduous idiosyncrasies. As daring and imaginative as Dryden's verses, he tempers even its highly dramatic moments with an ease and sense of control definitive of the taste of his times. This movement produced in France an impressive body of classical literature that distinguished the age of Louis XIV. In England it produced a literature often termed Augustan, after the writers who flourished during the reign of Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. Rome's Augustan age re-established stability after the civil war that followed the assassination of Julius Caesar. Its chief poets, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, addressed their polished works to a sophisticated aristocracy among whom they looked for patrons. Dryden's generation took advantage of the analogy between post-Civil War England and Augustan Rome. Later generations would be suspicious of that analogy. After 1700 most writers stressed that Augustus had been a tyrant who thought himself greater than the law. But in 1660 there was hope that Charles would be a better Augustus, bringing England the civilized virtues of an Augustan age without its vices. Charles and his followers brought back from exile an admiration of French literature as well as French fashions, and the theoretical correctness of such writers as Pierre Corneille, René Rapin, and Nicolas Roylia came into vogue. England also had a native tradition of classicism, derived from Ben Jonson and his followers, whose couplets embodied a refinement Dryden eagerly inherited and helped codify. The effort to formulate rules of good writing appealed to many critics of the age. Even Shakespeare had sometimes been careless, and although writers could not expect to surpass his genius, they might hope to avoid his faults. But neoclassical English literature aimed to be not only classical but new. Rochester and Dryden drew on literary traditions of variety, humor, and freewheeling fancy represented by Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare, Johnson, and Milton to infuse fresh life into Greek or Latin or French classical models. Above all, the new simplicity of style aimed to give pleasure to readers to express passions that everyone could recognize in language that everyone could understand. According to Dryden, Donne's amorous verse misguidedly perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage their hearts, and entertain them with the softnesses of love. Dryden's poems would not make that mistake. Like subsequent English critics, he values poetry according to its power to move an audience. Thus Timotheus, in Dryden's Alexander's Feast, is not only a musician but an archetypal poet who can make Alexander tearful or loving or angry at will. Readers, in turn, were supposed to cooperate with authors through the exercise of their own imaginations, creating pictures in the mind. When Timotheus describes vengeful ghosts holding torches, Alexander hallucinates in response and seizes a torch with zeal to destroy. Much 18th century poetry demands to be visualized. A phrase from Horace's Art of Poetry, ut pictura poesis, as in painting, so in poetry, was interpreted to mean that poetry ought to be a visual as well as verbal art. Pope's Eloisa to Abelard, for instance, begins by picturing two rival female personifications, heavenly pensive contemplation and ever musing melancholy. In the older typographical style, the nouns would be capitalized. Readers were expected to see these figures, contemplation, in the habit of a nun, whose eyes roll upward toward heaven, and the black goddess melancholy, in wings and drapery, who broods upon the darkness. These two competing visions fight for Eloisa's soul throughout the poem, which we see entirely through her perspective. 18th century readers knew how to translate words into pictures, and modern readers can share their pleasure by learning to see poetic images in the mind's eye. What poets most tried to see and represent was nature, a word of many meanings. The Augustans focused especially on one, nature as the universal and permanent elements in human experience. External nature, the landscape, attracted attention throughout the 18th century as a source of pleasure and an object of inquiry. But as Finch muses on the landscape, in a nocturnal reverie, it is her own soul she discovers. Pope's injunction to the critic, first follow a nature, has primarily human nature in view. A nature consists of the enduring, general truths that have been, are, and will be true for everyone in all times, everywhere. Hence the business of the poet, according to Johnson's Rasselas, is to examine, not the individual, but the species, to remark general properties and large appearances, to exhibit in his portraits of nature such prominent and striking features as recall the original to every mind. Yet if human nature was held to be uniform, human beings were known to be infinitely varied. Pope praises Shakespeare's characters as nature herself, but continues that every single character in Shakespeare is as much an individual as those in life itself. It is impossible to find any two alike. The general need not exclude the particular. In the vanity of human wishes, Johnson describes the sorrows of an old woman. I now kindred merit fills the sable bier, / now lacerated friendship claims a tear. Here kindred merit refers particularly to a worthy relative who has died, and lacerated friendship refers to a friend who has been wasted by violence or disease. Yet merit and friendship are also personifications, and the lines imply that the woman may be mourning the passing of goodness like her own or a broken friendship. Values and sympathies can die as well as people. This play on words is not a pun. Rather, it indicates a state of mind in which life assumes the form of a perpetual allegory and some abiding truth shines through each circumstance as it passes. The particular is already the general, in good 18th century verse. To study nature was also to study the ancients. Nature and Homer, according to Pope, were the same, and both Pope and his readers applied Horace's satires on Rome to their own world, because Horace had expressed the perennial forms of life. Moreover, modern writers could learn from the ancients how to practice their craft. If a poem is an object to be made, the poet, a word derived from the Greek for maker, must make the object to proper specify cations. Thus poets were taught to plan their works in one of the classical kinds or genres: epic, tragedy, comedy, pastoral, satire, or ode, to choose a language appropriate to that genre, and to select the right style and tone and rhetorical figures. The rules of art, as Pope had said, are nature methodized. At the same time, however, writers needed wit, quickness of mind, inventiveness, a knack for conceiving images and metaphors and for perceiving resemblance between things apparently unlike. Shakespeare had surpassed the ancients themselves in wit, and no one could deny that Pope was witty. Hence a major project of the age was to combine good method with wit, or judgment with fancy. Nature intended them to be one, and the role of judgment was not to suppress passion, energy, and originality, but to make them more effective through discipline. The winged courser, like a generous horse, / shows most true mettle when you check his course. The test of a poet's true mettle is language. When Wordsworth, in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, 1800, declared that he wrote in a selection of the language really used by men, he went on to attack 18th century poets for their use of an artificial and stock poetic diction. Many poets did employ a special language. It is characterized by personification, representing a thing or abstraction in human form, as when an ace of hearts steps forth or melancholy frowns; by periphrasis, a roundabout way of avoiding homely words, finny tribes for fish, or household feathery people for chickens; by stock phrases such as shining sword, verdant mead, bounding mane, and checkered shade; by words used in their original Latin sense, such as genial, gelid, and horrid; and by English sentences forced into Latin syntax. Here rests his head upon the lap of earth / a youth to fortune and to fame unknown, where youth is the subject of the verb rests. This language originated in the attempt of Renaissance poets to rival the elegant diction of Virgil and other Roman writers, and Milton depended on it to help him obtain answerable style for the lofty theme of paradise lost. When used mechanically it could become a mannerism. But Thomas Gray contrived subtle, expressive effects from artificial diction and syntax, as in the ironic inflation of ode on the death of a favorite cat, or a famous stanza from elegy written in a country churchyard. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. It is easy to misread the first sentence. What is the subject of awaits? The answer must be our, the only available singular noun, which lurks at the end of the sentence, ready to spring a trap not only on the reader but on all those aristocratic, powerful, beautiful, wealthy people who forget that their hour will come. Moreover, the intricacy of that sentence sets off the simplicity of the next, which says the same thing with deadly directness. The artful mix and elegy of a special poetic language, a language that nobody speaks with sentiments that everybody feels, helps account for the poem's enduring popularity. Versification also tests a poet's skill. The heroic couplet was brought to such perfection by Pope, Johnson thought, that to attempt any further improvement of versification will be dangerous. Pope's couplets, in rhythmed iambic pentameter, typically present a complete statement, closed by a punctuation mark. Within the binary system of these two lines, a world of distinctions can be compressed. The second line of the couplet might closely parallel the first in structure and meaning, for instance, or the two lines might antithetically play against each other. Similarly, because a slight pause called a caesura often divides the typical pentameter line, know then thyself, presume not God to scan, one part of the line can be made parallel with or antithetical to the other, or even to one part of the following line. An often quoted and parroted passage of Sir John Denham's Cooper's Hill, 1642, illustrates these effects. The poem addresses the Thames and builds up a witty comparison between the flow of a river and the flow of verse. Italics are added to highlight the terms compared. Parallelism, double balance, double balance. Oh, could I flow like thee, and make thy stream my great example, as it is my theme. Though deep, yet clear, though gentle, yet not dull, strong without rage, without overflowing, full. Once Dryden and Pope had bound such passages more tightly together with alliteration and assonance, the typical metrical rhetorical wit of the New Age had been perfected. For most of the 18th century its only metrical rival was blank verse, iambic pentameter that does not rhyme and is not closed in couplets. Milton's blank verse in Paradise Lost provided one model, and the dramatic blank verse of Shakespeare and Dryden provided another. This more expansive form appealed to poets who cared less for wit than for stories and thoughts with plenty of room to develop. Blank verse was favored as the best medium for descriptive and meditative poems, from Thomson's Seasons, 1726-30, to Cooper's The Task, 1785, and the tradition continued in Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey and Prelude. Yet not all poets chose to compete with Pope's wit or Milton's heroic striving. Ordinary people also wrote and read verse, and many of them neither knew nor regarded the classics. Only a minority of men, and very few women, had the chance to study Latin and Greek, but that did not keep a good many from playing with verse as a pastime or writing about their own lives. Hence the 18th century is the first age to reflect the modern tension between high and low art. While the heroic couplet was being perfected, doggerel also thrived, and Milton's blank verse was sometimes reduced to describing a drunk or an oyster. Burlesque and broad humor characterized the common run of 18th century verse. As the audience for poetry became more diversified, so did the subject matter. Eno readership was too small to address. Isaac Watts, and later Anna Laetitia Barbald and William Blake, wrote songs for children. The rise of unconventional forms and topics of verse subverted an older poetic ideal, the Olympian art that only a handful of the elect could possibly master. The 18th century brought poetry down to earth. In the future, art that claimed to be high would have to find ways to distinguish itself from the low. Restoration literature, 1660 to 1700. Dryden brought England to modern literature between 1660 and 1700. He combined a cosmopolitan outlook on the latest European trends with some of the richness and variety he admired in Chaucer and Shakespeare. In most of the important contemporary forms, occasional verse, comedy, tragedy, heroic play, ode, satire, translation, and critical essay, both his example and his precepts influenced others. As a critic, he spread the word that English literature, particularly his own, could be with the best of the past. As a translator, he made such classics as Ovid and Virgil available to a wide public. For the first time, a large number of women and men without a formal education could feel included in the literary world. Restoration prose clearly indicated the desire to reach a new audience. The styles of Donne's sermons, Milton's pamphlets, or Brown's treatises now seemed too elaborate and rhetorical for simple communication. By contrast, Pepys and Ben head straight to the point, informally and unself-consciously. The Royal Society asked its members to employ a plain, utilitarian prose style that spelled out scientific truths. Rhetorical flourishes and striking metaphors might be acceptable in poetry, which engaged the emotions, but they had no place in rational discourse. In polite literature, exemplified by Cowley, Dryden, and Sir William Temple, the ideal of good prose came to be a style with the ease and poise of well-bred urbane conversation. This is a social prose for a sociable age. Later, it became the mainstay of essayists like Addison and Steele, of 18th century novelists, and of the host of brilliant 18th century letter writers, including Montague, Horace Walpole, Gray, Cooper, and Burney, who still give readers the sense of being their intimate friends. Yet despite its broad appeal to the public, Restoration literature kept its ties to an aristocratic heroic ideal. The fierce wars and faithful loves of epic poems were expected to offer patterns of virtue for noble emulation. These ideals lived on in popular French prose romances and in Ben's Orinoco. But the ideal was most fully expressed in heroic plays like those written by Dryden, which pushed to extremes the conflict between love and honor in the hearts of impossibly valiant heroes and impossibly high-minded and attractive heroines. Dryden's best serious drama, however, was his blank verse tragedy All for Love, produced 1677, based on the story of Antony and Cleopatra. Instead of Shakespeare's worldwide panorama, his rapid shifts of scene and complex characters, this version follows the unities of time, place, and action, compressing the plot to the tragic last hours of the lovers. Two other tragic playwrights were celebrated in the Restoration and for a long time to come. M. Nathaniel Lee, ca. 1649-1692, known for violent plots and wild ranting, and the passionately sensitive Thomas Otway, 1652-1685. Rug comedy was the real distinction of Restoration drama. The best plays of Sir George Etheredge, The Man of Mode, 1676, William Wickerley, The Country Wife, 1675, Aphra Behn, The Rover, 1677, William Congreve, Love for Love, 1695, The Way Off World, 1700, and later George Farquhar, The Beau Stratagem, 1707, can still hold the stage today. These comedies of manners pick social behavior apart, exposing the nasty struggles for power among the upper classes, who use wit and manners as weapons. Human nature in these plays often conforms to the worst fears of Hobbes. Sensual, false-hearted, selfish characters prey on each other. The male hero lives for pleasure and for the money and women that he can conquer. The object of his game of sexual intrigue is a beautiful, witty, pleasure-loving, and emancipated lady, every bit as equal in the strategies of love. What makes the favored couple stand out is the true wit and well-bred grace with which they step through the minefield of the plot. But during the 1690s, societies for the reformation of manners began to attack the blasphemy and obscenity they detected in such plays, and they sometimes brought offenders to trial. When Dryden died in 1700, a more respectable society was coming into being. 18th century literature, 1700 to 1745. Early in the 18th century, a new and brilliant group of writers emerged: Swift, with The Tale of a Tub, 1704-10, Addison, with The Campaign, 1705, a poetic celebration of the Battle of Blenheim, Prior, with poems on several occasions, 1707, Steele, with The Tatler, 1709, and The Youthful Pope, in the same year, with his pastorals. These writers consolidate and popularize the social graces of the previous age. Determined to preserve good sense and civilized values, they turn their wit against fanaticism and innovation. Hence this is a great age of satire. Deeply conservative but also playful, their finest works often cast a strange light on modern times by viewing them through the screen of classical myths and classical forms. Thus Pope exposes the frivolity of fashionable London, in The Rape of the Lock, through the incongruity of verse that casts the idle rich as epic heroes. Similarly, Swift uses epic similes to mock the moderns in Time Battle of the Books, and John Gay's Trivia, or The Art of Walking the Streets of London, 1716, uses mock Georgics to order his tour of the city. Such incongruities are not entirely negative. They also provide a fresh perspective on things that had once seemed too low for poetry to notice. For instance, in The Rape of the Lock, a girl putting on her makeup. In this way, a parallel with classical literature can show not only how far the modern world has fallen but also how fascinating and magical it is when seen with quick, poetic eyes. The Augustine's effort to popularize and enforce high literary and social values was set against the new mass and multiplicity of writings that responded more spontaneously to the expanding commercial possibilities of print. The array of popular prose genres: news, thinly disguised political allegories, biographies of notorious criminals, travelogues, gossip, romantic tales often blended facts and patently fictional elements, cemented by a rich load of exaggeration, misrepresentations, and outright lies. Out of this matrix the modern novel would come to be born. The great master of such works was Daniel Defoe, producing first-person accounts such as Robinson Crusoe, 1719, The Famous Castaway, or Moll Flanders, 1722, Mistress of Low-Life Crime. Claims that such works present, as the editor of Crusoe says, a just history of fact. Believed or not, sharpened the public's avidity for them. Defoe shows his read. A world plausibly like the one they know, where ordinary people negotiate familiar, entangled problems of financial, emotional, and spiritual existence. Jane Barker, Mary Davies, and many others brought women's work and daily lives as well as love affairs to fiction. Such stories were not only amusing but also served as models of conduct. They influenced the stories that real people told about themselves. The theater also began to change its themes and effects to appeal to a wider audience. The clergyman Jeremy Collier had vehemently taken Dryden, W.Y.C.H. Orley, and Congreve to task in a short view off immorality and profaneness of the English stage, 1698, which spoke for the moral outrage of the pious middle classes. The wits retreated. The comedy of manners was replaced by a new kind, later called sentimental, not only because goodness triumphs over vice but also because it deals in high moral sentiments rather than witty dialogue, and because the embarrassments of its heroines and heroes move the audience not to laughter but to tears. Virtue refuses to bow to aristocratic codes. In one crucial scene of Steele's influential play The Conscious Lovers, 1722, the hero would rather accept dishonor than fight a duel with a friend. Piety and middle-class values typify tragedies such as George Lillo's London Merchant, 1731. One luxury invented in 18th-century Europe was the delicious pleasure of weeping, and comedies as well as tragedies brought that pleasure to playgoers through many decades. Some plays resisted the tide. Gay's cynical Baker's Opera, 1728, was a tremendous success, and later in the century the comedies of Goldsmith and Sheridan proved that sentiment is not necessarily an enemy to wit and laughter. Yet larger and larger audiences responded more to spectacles and special effects than to sophisticated writing. Although the stage prospered during the 18th century, and the star system produced idolized actors and actresses, such as David Garrick and Sarah Siddons, the authors of drama tended to fade to the background. Despite the sociable impulses of much the period's writing, readers also craved less crowded, more meditative works. Since the 17th century, no poems had been more popular than those about the pleasures of retirement, which invited the reader to dream about a safe retreat in the country or to meditate, like Finch, on scenery and the soul. But after 1726, when Thomson published Winter, the first of his cycle on the seasons, the poetry of natural description came into its own. A taste for gentle, picturesque beauty found expression not only in verse but in the elaborate, cultivated art of landscape gardening, and finally in the cherished English art of landscape painting in watercolor or oils, often illustrating Thomson's seasons. Many readers also learned to enjoy a thrilling pleasure or fear in the presence of the sublime in nature, rushing waters, wild prospects, and mountains shrouded in mist. Whether enthusiasts went to the landscape in search of God or merely of heightened sensations, they came back feeling that they had been touched by something beyond the life they knew, by something that could hardly be expressed. Tourists as well as poets roamed the countryside, frequently quoting verse as they gazed at some evocative scene. A partiality for the sublime passed from Thomson to Collins to inspire the poetry of the Romantic age to come. The emergence of new literary themes and modes, 1740-85. When Matthew Arnold called the 18th century an age of prose, he meant to belittle its poetry, but he also stated a significant fact: great prose does dominate the age. Until the 1740s, poetry tended to set the standards of literature. But the growth of new kinds of prose took the initiative away from verse. Novelists became better known than poets. Intellectual prose also flourished, with the achievements of Johnson in the essay and literary criticism, of Boswell in biography, of Hume in philosophy, of Burke in politics, of Edward Gibbon in history, of Sir Joshua Reynolds in aesthetics, of Gilbert White in natural history, and of Adam Smith in economics. Each of these authors is a master stylist, whose effort to express himself clearly and fully demands an art as carefully wrought as poetry. Other writers of prose were more informal. The memoirs of such women as Letitia Pilkington, Charlotte Sharkey, Hester Thrall Piazzi, and Frances Burney bring each reader into their private lives, and also remind us that the new print culture created celebrities, who wrote not only about themselves but about other celebrities they knew. The interest of readers in Samuel Johnson helped sell his own books as well as a host of books that quoted his sayings. But the prose of the age also had to do justice to difficult and complicated ideas. An unprecedented effort to formulate the first principles of philosophy, history, psychology, and art required a new style of persuasion. Johnson helped codify that language, not only with his writings but with the first great English dictionary, 1755. This work established him as a national man of letters. Eventually the period would be known as the Age of Johnson. But his dominance was based on an ideal of service to others. The dictionary illustrates its definitions with more than 114,000 quotations from the best English writers, thus building a bridge from past to present usage, and Johnson's essays, poems, and criticism also reflect his desire to preserve the lessons of the past. Yet he looks to the future as well, trying both to reach and to mold a nation of readers. If Johnson speaks for his age, one reason is his faith in common sense and the common reader. By the common sense of readers uncorrupted with literary prejudices, he wrote in the last of his Lives of the Poets, 1781, must be finally decided all claim to poetical honors. A similar respect for the good judgment of ordinary people, and for standards of taste and behavior that anyone can share, marks many writers of the age. Both Burke, the great conservative statesman and author, and Thomas Paine, his radical adversary, proclaim themselves apostles of common sense. No prose form better united availability to the common reader and seriousness of artistic purpose than the novel in the hands of two of its early masters, Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding. Like many writers of fiction earlier in the century, Richardson initially did not set out to entertain the public with an avowedly invented tale. He conceived Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, 1740, while compiling a little book of model letters. The letters grew into a story about a captivating young servant who resists her master's base designs on her virtue until he gives up and marries her. The combination of a high moral tone with sexual titillation and a minute analysis of the heroine's emotions and state of mind proved irresistible to readers in Britain and in Europe at large. Rich Arts topped Pamela's success with Clarissa, 1747-48, another epistolary novel, which explored the conflict between the libertine Lovelace, an attractive and diabolical aristocrat, and the angelic Clarissa, a middle-class paragon who struggles to stay pure. The sympathy that readers felt for Clarissa was Nified by a host of sentimental novels, including Francis Sheridan's Memoirs of Miss Sidney Bidett, 1761, Rousseau's Julie, or The New Heloise, 1761, and Henry Mackenzie's The Man of Feeling, 1771. Henry Fielding made his entrance into the novel by turning Pamela Farcy-Cally upside down, as the hero of Joseph Andrews, 1742, Pamela's brother, defends his chastity from the lewd advances of Lady Boobing. Fielding's true model, however, is Cervantes's great Don Quixote, 1605-15, from which he took an ironic, anti-romantic style, a plot of wandering around the countryside, and an idealistic central character, Parson Adams, who keeps mistaking appearances for reality. The ambition of writing what Fielding called a comic epic poem in prose went still further in the history of Tom Jones, a foundling, 1749. Crowded with incidents and comments on the state of England, the novel contrasts a good-natured, generous, wayward hero, who needs to learn prudence, with cold-hearted people who use moral codes and the law for their own selfish interests. This emphasis on instinctive virtue and vice, instead of Richardson's devotion to good principles, put off respectable readers like Johnson and Burney. But Coleridge thought that Tom Jones, along with Oedipus Rex and Johnson's Alchemist, was one of the three most perfect plots ever planned. An age of great prose can burden its poets. To Gray, Collins, Mark Akenside, and the brothers Joseph and Thomas Warton, it seemed that the spirit of poetry might be dying, driven out by the spirit of prose, by uninspiring truth, by the end of superstitions that had once peopled the land with poetic fairies and demons. In an age barren of magic, they ask, where has poetry gone? That question haunts many poems, suffusing them with melancholy. Poets who muse in silence are never far from thoughts of death, and a morbid fascination with suicide and the grave preoccupies many at mid-century. Such an attitude has little in common with that of poets like Dryden and Pope, social beings who live in a crowded world and seldom confess their private feelings in public. Pope's essay on man had taken a sunny view of Providence, Edward Young's The Complaint, or I Night Thoughts on Life, Death, and Immortality, 1742-46, an immensely long poem in blank verse, is darkened by Christian fear of the life to come. Often the melancholy poet withdraws into himself and yearns to be living in some other time and place. In his Ode to Fancy, 1746, Joseph Warton associated fancy with visions in the wilderness and spontaneous passions. The true poet was no longer defined as a craftsman or maker but as a seer or nature's priest. The public has seen all that art can do, William Shenstone wrote in 1761, welcoming James Macpherson's Ossian, and they want the more striking efforts of wild, original, enthusiastic genius. Macpherson filled the bill. His primitive, sentimental epics, supposedly translated from an ancient Gaelic warrior bard, won the hearts of readers around the world. M. Napoleon and Thomas Jefferson, for instance, both thought that Ossian was greater than Homer. Poets began to cultivate archaic language and antique forms. Inspired by Thomas Percy's edition of Relics of Ancient English Poetry, 1765, Thomas Chatterton passed off his own ballads as medieval. He died at 17, soon after his forgeries were exposed, but the Romantics later idolized his precocious genius. The most remarkable consequence of the medieval revival, however, was the invention of the Gothic novel. Horace Walpole set the Castle of Otranto, 1765, a dreamlike tale of terror, in a simulacrum of Strawberry Hill, his own tiny, pseudo-medieval castle, which helped revive a taste for Gothic architecture. Walpole created a mode of fiction that retains its popularity to the present day. In a typical Gothic romance, amid the glooms and secret passages of some remote castle, the laws of nightmare replace the laws of probability. Forbidden themes incest, murder, necrophilia, atheism, and the torments of sexual desire are allowed free play. Most such romances, like William Beckford's Vathek, 1786, and Matthew Lewis's The Monk, 1796, revel in sensationalism and the grotesque. The Gothic vogue suggested that classical canons of taste, simplicity and harmonious balance might count for less than the pleasures of fancy intricate puzzles and a willful excess. But Gothicism also resulted in works, like Anne Radcliffe's, that temper romance with reality as well as in serious novels of social purpose, like William Godwin's Caleb Williams, 1794, and Mary Wollstonecraft's Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, 1798, and Mary Shelley, the daughter of Wollstonecraft and Godwin, eventually composed A Romantic Nightmare, Frankenstein, 1818, that continues to haunt our dreams. The century abounded in other remarkable experiments in fiction, anticipating many of the forms that novelists still use today. Tobias Smollett's picaresque Roderick Random, 1748, and Humphrey Clinker, 1771, delight in coarse practical jokes, the freaks and strong odors of life. But the most novel novelist of the age was Lawrence Sterne, a humorous, sentimental clergyman who loves to play tricks on his readers. The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, 1760-67, abandons clock time for psychological time, whimsically follows chance associations, interrupts its own stories, violates the conventions of print by putting chapters 18 and 19 after chapter 25, sneaks in double entendres, and seems ready to go on forever. And yet these games get us inside the characters' minds, as if the world were as capricious as our thoughts. Sterne's self-conscious art implies that people's private obsessions shape their lives or help create reality itself. As unique as Sterne's fictional world is, his interest in private life matched the concerns of the novel toward the end of the century. Depictions of characters' intimate feelings dominated the tradition of domestic fiction that included Burney, Radcliffe, and, later, Maria Edgeworth, culminating in the masterworks of Jane Austen. A more masculine orientation emerged at the beginning of the next century, as Walter Scott's works, with their broad historical scope and outdoor scenes of men at work and war, appealed to a large readership. Yet the copious, acute, often ironic attention to details of private life by Richardson, Sterne, and Austen continued to influence the novel profoundly through its subsequent history. Continuity and revolution. The history of 18th century literature was first composed by the Romantics, who wrote it to serve their own interests. Prizing originality, they naturally preferred to stress how different they were from writers of the previous age. Later historians have tended to follow their lead, competing to prove that everything changed in 1776, or 1789, or 1798. This revolutionary view of history accounts for what happened to the word revolution. The older meaning referred to a movement around a point, a recurrence, or cycle, as in the revolutions of the planets. The newer meaning signified a violent break with the past, an overthrow of the existing order, as in the Big Bang or the French Revolution. Romantic rhetoric made heavy use of such dramatic upheavals. Yet every history devoted to truth must take account of both sorts of revolution, of continuities as well as changes. The ideals that many romantics made there own the passion for liberty and equality, the founding of justice on individual rights, the distrust of institutions, the love of nature, the reverence for imagination, and even the embrace of change grew from seeds that had been planted long before. Nor did Augustan literature abruptly vanish on that day in 1798 when Wordsworth and Coleridge anonymously published a small and unsuccessful volume of poems called Lyrical Ballads. Even when they rebel against the work of Pope and Johnson and Gray, romantic writers incorporate much of their language and values. What Restoration and 18th century literature passed on to the future, in fact, was chiefly a set of unresolved problems. The Age of Enlightenment was also, in England, an age that insisted on holding fast to older beliefs and customs. The age of population explosion was also an age of individualism. The age that developed the slave trade was also the age that gave rise to the abolitionist movement. The age that codified rigid standards of conduct for women was also an age when many women took the chance to read and write and think for themselves. The age of reason was also the age when sensibility flourished. The last classical age was also the first modern age. These contradictions are far from abstract. Writers were forced to choose their own directions. When young James Boswell looked for a mentor whose biography he might write, he considered not only Samuel Johnson but also David Hume, whose skeptical views of morality, truth, and religion were everything Johnson abhorred. The two writers seemed to inhabit different worlds, yet Boswell traveled freely between them. That was exciting and also instructive. Without contraries is no progression, according to one citizen of Hunson's London, William Blake, who also thought that opposition is true friendship. Good conversation was a lively 18th century art, and sharp disagreements did not keep people from talking. The conversations the period started have not ended yet. Texts. 1660. 1662. Samuel Pepys begins his diary. Samuel Butler, Hudibras, Part 1. 1667 John Milton, Paradise Lost 1668 Posey. 1678 Part 1 1681. 1687. John Dryden, Essay. John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress. Dryden, Absalom, and Achitophel. Sir Isaac M. Newton, Principia Mathematica 1688. 1690 Human 1700. Aphra Ben, Orunico. John Locke, an SACONC Eaming Understanding William Congreve, The Way of the Word. Mary Estelle, Some Reflections upon Mamage. 1704 Jonathan Swift, A Tale of a Tub. Newton, Optics. 1711 Alexander Pope, An Essay on Criticism. Joseph Addison and Sir Richard Steele, Spectator, 1711-12, 1714. Contexts. 1660 Charles II restored to the throne. Reopening of the theatres 1662 Act of Uniformity requires all clergy to obey the Church of England. Chartering of the Royal Society 1664-66 Great Plague of London 1666. Of Dramatic 1668. 1673. Fire destroys the City of London. Dryden becomes Poet Laureate. Test Act requires all office holders to swear allegiance to Anglicanism 1678 The Popish plot inflames anti-Catholic feeling 1681 Charles II dissolves Parliament 1685 Death of Charles II. James II, his Catholic brother, takes the throne. 1688-89 The Glorious Revolution. James II exiled and succeeded by his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. 1701 begins 1702. War of the Spanish Succession. Death of William III. Succession of Anne, Protestant daughter of James II. 1707-1710. 1713. Act of Union with Scotland Tories take power. Treaty of Utrecht ends War of the Spanish Succession 1714 Death of Queen Anne. George I, great-grandson of James I, becomes the first Hanoverian king. Tory government replaced by Whigs. Texts. 1716 Lady Mary Wortley Montagu writes her letters from Turkey, 1716-18, 1717 Pope, The Rape of the Lock, final version 1719 Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe. 1726 Swift, Gulliver's Travels. 1728 John Gay, The Beggar's Opera 1733. 1740 1742 1743. Pope, An Essay on Man. Samuel Richardson, Pamela Henry Fielding, Joseph Andrews Pope, The Dunciad, final version. William Hogarth, Mamage J. Mode 1746 William Collins's Odes. 1747 1749 1751. Richardson, Clarissa Fielding, Tom Jones Thomas Gray, Elegy written in a country churchyard 1755 Samuel Johnson, Dictionary. 1759. 1760. Johnson, Rasselas. Voltaire, Candide. Lawrence Sturm, Tunstrom Shandy, 1760-67, 1765 Johnson's edition of Shakespeare. 1770 Oliver Goldsmith, The Deserted Village. 1776 Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations 1778 1779 81. 1783 1785. Francis Burney, Evelina Johnson, Lives of the Poets, 1779. George Crabbe, The Village. Contexts. 1720 1721. 1727. 1737. 1742. South Sea Bubble collapses. Robert Walpole comes to power. George I dies. George II succeeds. Licensing Act censors the stage. Walpole resigns. 1746 Charles Edward Stuart's defeat at Culloden ends the last Jacobite rebellion. 1751 Robert Clive seizes Arcot, the prelude to English control of India. 1756 Beginning of Seven Years' War. 1759 James Wolfe's capture of Quebec ensures British control of Canada. 1760 George III succeeds to the throne. 1768 Captain James Cook voyages to Australia and New Zealand. 1775 American Revolution. 1775 to 83. James Watt produces steam engines. 1780 Gordon riots in London. 1783 William Cooper, the task William Pitt becomes Prime Minister.